following document was recovered from the archived records of the Veylith Institute. Its authenticity has never been publicly acknowledged. Archive 1, Case File 003, Classification, Mnemosyne. Date of initial observation, September 2022. Location, Brno, Czech Republic. When Elena Novak first noticed the drawings, she assumed it was another example of children influencing one another. It wasn't unusual for an idea to spread through an entire classroom. One child drew a dragon, another gave it wings, a third colored it differently, and by the end of the day, every notebook contained some version of the same creature. After nearly 20 years of teaching, she had learned that children rarely borrowed exact drawings. They borrowed ideas, then quietly convinced themselves the ideas had always been their own. Martin Kovaj's sketch seemed no different at first. He had finished his mathematics assignment before everyone else and spent the remaining lesson drawing on the back of his worksheet. Elena collected the paper with the rest of the classwork and forgot about it until later that afternoon, when she unfolded it while marking assignments. Instead of another imaginary creature, she found a city. The perspective wandered, several buildings leaned at impossible angles, and the proportions changed from one side of the page to the other. But none of that held her attention for very long. Children often ignored perspective. What caught her eye was the arrangement of the city itself. The streets connected naturally, the bridges appeared to lead somewhere, and the buildings seemed to occupy deliberate positions rather than random spaces on a page. Above the skyline, 3 moons overlooked the city with the same certainty as every tower beneath them. It looked less like imagination than recollection. She smiled, wrote, "Very imaginative" in the corner of the page, and continued marking the remaining assignments, convinced she had already given the drawing more attention than it deserved. That certainty lasted until another student handed in a sketch of what appeared to be the same city. The second drawing approached it from a different direction, revealing buildings Martin had never drawn, yet the skyline remained unmistakably familiar. Before the afternoon lessons ended, 4 more children had produced their own versions without being asked to draw anything at all. After the classroom emptied, Elena arranged the 6 drawings across her desk. The similarities were obvious, but they weren't the similarities usually produced by copying. If one child copies another, the mistakes survive the journey as faithfully as everything else. Here, the opposite had happened. Each picture answered questions raised by the previous one. A bridge ended abruptly on one page, only to continue naturally in another. A tower, visible only in the distance, became the subject of a different drawing. Together, the pictures resembled 6 independent observations of the same place. The simplest explanation was that someone had seen an illustration outside school and described it to the others. Children shared stories from books, films, and the internet every day, often forgetting where the ideas had come from in the first place. Elena asked Martin the following morning where he had first seen the city. "I didn't." The answer caught her off guard. "So where did you get the idea?" Martin looked down at the drawing as though he was surprised she didn't already know. "I remembered it." Elena let the conversation end there. Children often struggled to explain where ideas came from, and memory, dreams, and imagination had a habit of blending together at that age. Had the incident ended with Martin, she would probably have forgotten it before the end of the month. The emails arrived the following afternoon. They came through a regional education coordinator who occasionally connected schools across Central Europe. Teachers from Austria, Poland, Germany, and Norway had contacted the department after noticing unusually similar drawings appearing in their own classrooms. Elena opened the attachments expecting to recognize broad similarities, but instead found the same city she had left pinned to the notice board behind her desk. She spent the next 2 days speaking with the teachers whose contact details appeared in the emails. Most had followed almost exactly the same line of questioning she had. They assumed the children had copied an illustration from the internet until repeated searches failed to identify anything resembling the city. The investigation had reached the same dead end in every classroom. One teacher from Bergen mentioned that she had eventually stopped asking where the children had seen the city because none of them could answer the question. "So what did you ask instead?" Elena said. "I asked when they had been there." "And?" The woman hesitated before continuing. "They remembered the place. They just couldn't remember ever arriving there." The growing collection of drawings eventually reached far beyond the schools where they had first appeared. After failing to identify a common source, the Regional Education Department forwarded every interview, photograph, and teacher's report to researchers at Masaryk University, asking whether the similarities could be explained through known patterns of childhood behavior. Their conclusion, delivered 6 days later, was cautious but unusually direct. The drawings could not be attributed to collaboration, coincidence, or any identifiable external influence. Every conventional explanation remained possible in theory, yet none of them survived comparison with the available evidence. The report might have remained an academic curiosity had it ended there. Instead, it was forwarded to another organization whose name appeared only once in the distribution record. None of the researchers recognized it, and none of them remembered adding it to the list of recipients. The Veylith Institute acknowledged receipt less than 3 hours later. The Institute requested every original drawing rather than scanned copies, along with the complete interview transcripts, classroom seating plans, and attendance records from each participating school. No explanation accompanied the request. The covering letter simply stated that the material had been assigned Case File 003, classified Nemazany, and transferred to the Veylith Institute for immediate review. The investigation began by testing the assumption every previous team had accepted without question. Instead of asking whether the children had drawn the same city, Institute researchers asked whether they had described the same place. Every reference to a bridge, staircase, river, tower, and public square was extracted from the interview transcripts and cataloged independently of the drawings themselves. The names of the children, their ages, and even the countries in which they lived were deliberately removed before the comparison began. The results proved more difficult to dismiss than anyone expected. Children who had never met one another described the same landmarks from different viewpoints, often supplying details that appeared insignificant in isolation but became meaningful when placed beside another interview. A bridge mentioned briefly by one child connected naturally to a district described by another several hundred kilometers away. A staircase that seemed to lead nowhere in one drawing emerged from the base of a tower that appeared only in a different classroom, spoken about in another language by a child who could not possibly have known the first existed. By the end of the reconstruction, the Institute had assembled something none of the participating schools realized they had been collecting. Instead of an ordinary collection of children's drawings, those were parts of an internally consistent map of a city that did not exist. The preliminary findings were circulated internally that evening. Most departments regarded the case as an unusually sophisticated example of collective memory formation, a phenomenon that had occasionally appeared in neurological literature, although never on this scale. The Veylith Institute disagreed. Their response occupied only 2 sentences. The anomaly is not the city. Continue investigating the memory. The reconstructed city occupied almost an entire wall inside the Veylith Institute by the time Dr. Adrian Mercer joined the investigation. Over 200 drawings had been arranged according to their shared landmarks, until individual sketches became difficult to distinguish from the reconstruction they collectively produced. The result was remarkable, but it also created an unexpected problem. The researchers had become increasingly confident that the city was internally consistent, yet they possessed no reliable way of determining whether that consistency reflected the children's memories or their own tendency to recognize patterns where none existed. Mercer spent less than 10 minutes studying the reconstruction before asking for the original interview transcripts. The request surprised the research team. They had expected him to examine the map itself, compare architectural details, or question the statistical methods used to assemble it. Instead, he ignored the city almost entirely and spent the rest of the morning reading conversations that everyone else believed had already served their purpose. By the afternoon meeting, Mercer had filled only 2 pages of his notebook. Neither contained observations about the city. Both contained questions about memory. Every child described familiar streets, recognized landmarks, and spoke naturally about moving through the city. Yet the transcripts became noticeably different whenever the teachers tried to move backwards through those memories. The children remembered being inside the city, but none could describe the first moment they had entered it. The beginning of every memory appeared to have been removed, while everything that followed remained strangely intact. Mercer offered no explanation. Before leaving the meeting, he suggested repeating the experiment under one additional condition. If the children were reconstructing genuine memories, the Institute should be able to determine whether those memories behaved like ordinary recollection or whether they obeyed a different set of rules. The proposal required only a minor change to the existing reconstruction. One landmark was deliberately altered. The central bridge, which appeared in more drawings than any other structure, was moved several streets from its original position before copies of the completed map were sent back to the participating schools. The teachers were instructed not to mention the alteration and not to ask leading questions. Each child received the same map and the same request. Tell us if anything looks wrong.
The interviews reached the Institute over the following week. Most children studied the reconstruction quietly before tracing familiar routes with a pencil. Some corrected the bridge immediately. Others continued examining the map until they reached the river and then stopped, looking at the page with the same puzzled expression. None accepted the alteration without hesitation. Every child who identified the bridge moved it back to exactly the same position, despite having no access to the original reconstruction or to one another's drawings. Several went further, adding nearby buildings that had never appeared on the Institute's map, but later matched additions made independently by children interviewed in different countries. The research team repeated the comparison twice more before discussing the results. Different analysts reviewed the corrected maps independently, each working without access to previous reconstructions. The outcome remained unchanged. The bridge returned to the same location every time, and the surrounding district became more detailed with each new correction instead of less. Ordinary memory rarely behaved that way. Recollection became less reliable as uncertainty increased. These memories appeared to become more precise. Mercer read the final report without making a single amendment. When the meeting concluded, he closed the file and left only one handwritten note attached to the cover. The anomaly is not the city. The anomaly is that independent memory converges instead of diverging. The Institute's investigation had reached the point where geography could no longer explain the evidence. The next stage would require questioning something far more fundamental: how memory itself was believed to work. The investigation continued for another 3 weeks after the final interviews had been completed. The Institute no longer questioned whether the children had influenced one another. That possibility had been exhausted by the reconstruction itself. Every new comparison strengthened the same conclusion. Independent corrections consistently reduced uncertainty instead of introducing it, producing a map whose internal consistency became increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The completed reconstruction covered almost 12 square meters by the time the analysis was finished. Architects examined its layout before archaeologists were invited to review it. Neither group recognized the city's design. It lacked the features normally expected of an ancient settlement. There were no defensive walls, no military fortifications, and no obvious religious complexes. Streets curved naturally around open courtyards before converging toward a network of circular buildings whose purpose nobody could identify. Large sections of the city appeared devoted to observation rather than habitation, as though the people who built it had considered the surrounding landscape more important than the structures themselves. The astronomical details proved even more difficult to explain. Every child who included the night sky placed 3 moons above the horizon. Their sizes varied slightly from drawing to drawing, yet their relative positions remained remarkably consistent. Astronomers invited to review the reconstruction concluded that no stable orbital configuration matching those observations could exist anywhere within Earth's celestial environment. If the children had remembered a real sky, it had not been one visible from this planet. Mercer spent several evenings comparing the interviews with a completed map. A detail that had passed unnoticed during the earlier stages of the investigation became impossible to ignore once the transcripts were read together. Whenever the children spoke about the city, they described it with the familiarity people reserve for places they once called home. They argued over the quickest route to the bridge, remembered where certain streets became steep, and occasionally disagreed about which building offered the best view of the river. They spoke as former residents might disagree about a childhood neighborhood. None of them spoke as though they were inventing it. His report offered no theory about the city's origin. There was no evidence to support one. It simply observed that the investigation had begun with children's drawings and ended with something considerably more difficult to dismiss. Hundreds of unrelated memories had contributed fragments of a place that no individual appeared capable of remembering alone.
The schools received the conventional explanation, describing the incident as an unusual example of convergent imagination. Life gradually returned to normal. The drawing stopped. The interviews ended. Over the following year, the children lost the remarkable certainty that had first attracted the Institute's attention. Most could still remember taking part in the investigation, but the city itself retreated beyond reach. They recognized their own drawings without understanding why they had once believed every line on the page represented something real. Before the file was transferred to Archive 1, Mercer added a short note recommending that future investigations involving unexplained memory phenomena should be reviewed alongside cases 001 and 002 before independent analysis began. The recommendation was accepted without discussion and quietly became standard procedure. Several months later, while preparing material for Project Echo, a researcher noticed an unexpected similarity shared by all 3 investigations. The anomalies themselves had been completely different, yet each case depended upon information appearing before any identifiable source could account for it. In one investigation, information arrived before it had been transmitted. In another, observation determined which version of reality survived. In case file 003, memory reconstructed knowledge that none of the witnesses had ever acquired. No explanation accompanied the comparison. Only a handwritten remark attached to the front of the file. Perhaps information does not always travel through reality. Perhaps, on rare occasions, reality travels through information. The annotation was never signed. Case file 003 was archived.
Cross-reference added following routine review by Project Echo. An independent field investigation submitted under Project Genesis contains observational similarities requiring future comparison. Current evidence is insufficient to establish a causal relationship. No action recommended. The referenced investigation has been archived separately as Case File 004. Internal Record Receiving Project, Genesis. Reviewing Project, Echo. Reason for cross-reference? Multiple independent observations may involve the same unidentified geographic region. Further analysis deferred pending completion of the Genesis investigation. End of Case File 003.
Next archive. Case file 004. The migration that had no destination.